At last, a voice for those who pay big government's bills, not those who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. Here on Gimme Radio, I am your host, Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Welcome to our latest installment. We're going to start out with an interesting word today. It's called Twitter. No, it's not the Americanized version of the English insult twit, nor does it have anything to do with that little yellow character Tweety Bird in the Warner Brothers cartoons. It is rather the new technology that will lead the taxpayer movement ever higher, ever stronger, ever better in the future. Here to tell us about that is a fellow, our state government affairs manager who never joshes with us, Josh Culling. Welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the fun introduction, Pete.
Well, why don't you start by telling Gimme Radio listeners, what exactly is Twitter?
Twitter is essentially what's known as a microblogging platform. It's a way microblogging meaning to blog in a lot shorter format. Essentially, users sign up for an account at twitter.com, and they have 140 characters or less, about 2 sentences or less, to answer the question, "What are you doing?" Now, that can be as mundane as I'm having a ham and cheese sandwich right now, or it can be a little more informational, such as I'm reading this Wall Street Journal editorial, and then a link for other Twitter users to see. Now, for other people to see what's known as tweeting, they need to follow you. So, for example, I have about 675 followers who, every time I tweet, they see that information.
Okay. So this would be useful for individuals and also organizations like the National Taxpayers Union.
Yeah, organizations such as NTU will link their blog posts to their Twitter profile. Relevant information about what their staff members are doing or opinion pieces that they've put out recently. It's a good way for some people who are less likely to read a blog and go through, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs of information and want a short, succinct message. And if they think it's intriguing, then they'll click the link and read the rest of it for themselves.
So for Gimme Radio listeners, this is almost like an updated version of Pass It On, that old game where you had a piece of information, something no longer than a sentence, and you kept whispering it in the ear down the line in a whole circle of people. But in this case, it doesn't come out all mangled on the end. The message just keeps cycling to hundreds of people.
Yeah, 2 things about Twitter that make it unique. One is its viral marketing value. People see these little tidbits and they're much more likely to pass them on in their current form because they're so short. And, the more people that see them, the more will, click on that. And it's a great way to disseminate information quickly. The other is people who talk about Twitter or who have, I guess, studied social networking say that about 95% of what you see on Twitter you don't care about at all. It's the 5% that you do that really kind of makes a difference. So the more content that you can blast out in short little segments, somebody's going to find something that they like and that they're interested in.
Lets you separate that wheat from the chaff real quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And one way that here at NTU that we've been kind of highlighting some of our tweets above others is to use something that's called a hashtag, correct? Where it's just basically the pound sign and then a keyword. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about Statebooks then?
Okay. Well, first, just quickly, what a hashtag is it's a way to categorize tweets and aggregate them based on a certain subject area. So, and the way a hashtag is created is you use the pound sign followed by some word or combination of letters and numbers. And then that can be easily searched based on the hashtag that punctuates the tweet. For example, at the Republican National Convention in this past election cycle, people were tweeting about things that were going on at the convention, events they were attending, speakers that they were seeing, and then punctuating it with pound RNC08. And anyone could search for RNC08 on the internet and go through the entire stream of everything that was going on at the Republican National Convention. It's kind of an easy way to put people who can't physically be somewhere in the middle of the action. So what we've done at NTU is created Statebooks. It's a website at www.statebooks.org that aggregates all tweets with #statebooks at the end of them. And what that indicates is any tweet that has anything to do with state economic or fiscal policy. So that could be, Governor Doyle of Wisconsin just released his budget for the next 2 years, and it includes $2.5 billion in tax hikes. Or it could be the fact that Florida is getting $8 billion in federal stimulus money and therefore isn't going to hike cigarette taxes. Any news that anyone has on state economic or fiscal policy that they tweet about can be easily searched on the Statebooks website.
Yeah, so what you're going to see, Gimme Radio listeners, when you go to statebooks.org is just a whole bunch of short messages, very succinct messages, so that whatever state you live in or whatever issue you're following that involves state and local policy making, you're likely to find it in, a minute or two?
Yeah, and that's the beauty of the community aspect of Twitter is it's not a bunch of policy analysts sitting around and regurgitating, what's going on in the states. It's policy analysts, yes, but also politicians, regular folks, people who read the newspaper and who want to pass along that information. So you literally have hundreds of people across the country letting everyone else know what's going on in their state.
Who are some of the politicians that have started using Twitter and Statebooks specifically?
Well, as far as Twitter, there are politicians at all levels of government all across the country that are using it. As far as Statebooks, one of our big politicians is Governor Rick Perry of Texas, who started to tweet about some of the things that are going on in the Lone Star State with respect to property taxes, federal bailouts, and things of that nature. We also have a variety of state legislators in Iowa, South Carolina, and Ohio that have used it, and a couple other people. We're trying to expand the list of legislators, but that's one of the kind of end goals for Statebooks is to really increase accountability in government by allowing legislators to tweet from the House or Senate floor about what's going on through budgetary processes and things of that nature to really let citizens who want to know what goes on behind closed doors kind of key them in on that process.
Not only is it going on behind closed doors and being revealed on Twitter, I guess it's even faster than what you would find online. Goodness knows if you go to the state legislature's website of a given state, it's likely that they won't post what happened in terms of votes and committee action until the day after, if you're lucky.
When I first started at NTU, there was a transportation tax hike battle in the Virginia House that the governor called a special session to try and raise taxes on transportation, and I was desperate to follow those proceedings. And luckily, there was a reporter who was sitting on the floor, and he started a blog where he was updating live throughout the night on the proceedings. Now, unfortunately, that's very rare. You don't get reporters who are giving you live information like that. What Twitter allows you to do is have reporters in every legislator that's sitting in on these committee meetings, and they are, kind of bypassing the middleman and getting that information straight to the people, so you know right as it happens what's going on.
That's interesting, and also I guess the other benefit of Twitter is that it could turn everyday citizens into reporters of some kind. If you know of a local tax hike or some breaking news article in your community, then you could essentially just tweet it and all of your followers would see what's going on.
Sure, and one of my responsibilities at NTU is to get our organization involved and the weight of our membership involved in tax hikes at the state and local level. And without people coming to me and informing me of property tax battles, for example, I can't know what's going on in all 50 states and in thousands of counties across the country. But by browsing Statebooks at the beginning and end of every day, I can I can catch a glimpse of some of the things that I wouldn't otherwise have known about.
So, Gimme Radio listeners, how many among you out there are wannabe reporters? You don't have to wear a press pass or a funny hat or drag around a big old camera or a typewriter. You can now be a reporter, imparting valuable information about taxes and spending in your own state, in your own county, in your own city, simply by visiting statebooks.org.
And you don't have to have a Twitter account to view Statebooks. You just need internet access, statebooks.org, and you can read about what's going on around the country. Is that right, Josh?
That is correct.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you on again in a couple weeks.
Thanks a lot.
And in this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio, I'm about to do a very poor imitation. I hope, listeners, you will forgive me. Oh, fiddle-dee-dee, death and taxes and childbirth. There's never enough time for any of them. That was my really bad imitation of Scarlett O'Hara, whom I'm paraphrasing in Gone with the Wind. And, well, unfortunately, about, 150 years later, well, we're facing higher taxes from the Obama administration. Last week we talked about mostly the spending implications of Barack Obama's 5-year budget plan. Today we'd like to talk a little more about the actual tax policies, the revenue side of the ledger. And there are some frightening things written down on that paper as well. One, for example, are a raft of tax increases proposed on supposedly the wealthiest Americans, joint filers at $250,000 of income or more, single folks making $200,000 or more. You may believe, well, that's only the part that will raise the most revenue. Mostly everything else won't affect us, so why worry? Sorry, hate to burst your bubble. Here we have an interesting parallel with Bill Clinton's administration back in 1993 when he ran on a campaign of saying, we will only raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans, the ones who benefited from tax cuts during the 1980s. Well, Barack Obama said the same thing, only he updated it and said, well, we're only going to raise taxes on the wealthy who benefited from the Bush tax cuts. Just who are these people? The top 1% of earners in the United States of America account for 20% of all the income, 40% of all the federal income taxes. Let me repeat that, folks. The wealthiest 1% of Americans are pulling twice their load in taxes versus how much they are making in this economy. They begin at an income threshold of, well, just under $400,000. You're certainly not hurting if you're making that kind of money, but as I've said before, those who say this tax system is unfair are absolutely right. It's unfair to people who make higher incomes, who aspire to the American dream. Go down the income scale a little bit more to the top 10% of earners as defined by the IRS. That begins at about $110,000 of income. For those of you who live on the coast, Gimme Radio listeners, you may very well be thinking, hey, that's very close to what I make. Well, welcome to the top 10% of taxpayers. You have to pay 71% of all the federal income taxes, almost 3/4 by the top 10th. Go to the top quarter. Now this probably encompasses most Gimme Radio listeners. It begins at an income threshold of about $65,000. That could be a 2-earner family just starting out, a single-earner family, perhaps retirees who have a pension and some investments, well, at least ones that haven't been wiped out in this stock market. It's a crazy system when the top quarter of taxpayers shell out for 86% of the top income of the total income tax burden.
Well, what about Obama's claim that 95% of Americans will see a tax cut? Is that accurate, and what really does that mean for taxpayers?
Well, it's important to remember, Natasha, that the bottom half of taxpayers, of income earners in this country, actually aren't taxpayers. They're not paying anything in taxes. They have almost a zero liability. In fact, there are about 40 million households in America, families, single folks, perhaps students, who have zero or a negative tax liability. How in the world can you have a negative tax liability? Through a little accounting trick called refundability. That means if there's a tax credit out there that's made refundable, you can get the whole credit even if your tax liability is smaller than the credit amount. It's like getting money back from the government that's welfare. So when we're talking about 95% of Americans seeing their tax bills cut, a huge slice of that consists of people who pay nothing in taxes. They are actually going to get these refundable credits, and in so doing, because the government counts that as outlays, as spending, they're going to be adding to the federal budget deficit. And as for the other half of folks in there that might be expecting a large tax cut, forget it. At best, if you're a couple filing jointly, married, and still working, you might get $600 of tax credit. If you're retired, as many Gimme Radio listeners undoubtedly might be, well, you're not even entitled to that tax credit. It'll be a small $250, maybe $300 payment. We're not sure yet because, of course, this is all a blueprint that Obama's proposing. May be different by the time it comes out and Congress decides what to do with it. But right now, seniors get only a tiny amount of tax relief. And this proposal is actually a far cry from what Obama was saying on the campaign trail. He promised that seniors making $50,000 a year or less would pay no federal income taxes. Now, he still says he wants to reach that goal at some point or another. It's on the White House website, but it is not in his current budget. It is not in his 5-year budget projection either. So anyone out there who had a relatively modest retirement income, or perhaps a comfortable one in some parts of the country of $50,000 or less, you're out of luck. That is a broken promise, at least according to Barack Obama's budget. And all of this brings me back to Bill Clinton, folks. He made some promises of his own that only millionaires would have to pay the 39.6% top tax rate he proposed. That was later taken down to 250,000 millionaires. He said the middle class would have no new taxes imposed on them. He decided, well, no, had to break that promise too. Proposed a BTU tax based on how much energy a given household used. Congress didn't pass that, but did pass other kinds of middle-class taxes in its place. And now, fast forward to 2009, there is a middle-class tax increase contained in Barack Obama's budget in the form of energy taxes. It's a very sneaky tax, is it not, Natasha?
It is, Pete. Obama, in his budget outline last week, also laid out a number of tax increases on the energy industry, namely a $30 billion tax increase on oil and gas companies, one of the few industries still actively contributing to the U.S. economy. And also, in addition to the tax increases, he's limiting the ability for Americans to explore domestic energy supplies, which could reduce energy costs. So on the one hand, he's raising taxes. On the other hand, he's imposing resource restrictions in a time of economic recession. And this counterproductive plan is a double whammy for taxpayers.
Well, it's easy to beat up on oil companies for the way prices of gasoline at the pump continually fluctuate. They're going up now. They were at a very low level, more further back into the past. But now I think we need to understand the basic principle behind taxation, and that is businesses don't pay taxes, people do. When you raise taxes on any company, whether it makes automobiles, whether it is a restaurant, whether it manufactures food, any place, any firm does not actually pay taxes. It is the people involved, the workers with the firm, who lose out on raises or job opportunities. The investors in the firm, sometimes millions of middle-class shareholders who might have put stock in the company through a mutual fund. You also have managers who might lose out. They might not be able to keep their jobs. You also have customers affected by higher taxes on companies because oftentimes the prices are simply passed along to us. Those are the kinds of ways companies and businesses respond to higher taxes. There really are no other ways. It's not as if they can suddenly say, okay, we're going to absorb all these losses. We're going to keep doing business the same way we have been, keep declaring the same great stock dividends, keep our prices at the same level, keep everybody that we now have on staff hired. It's impossible, folks. It just doesn't work that way.
And part of the administration's budget outline also includes what is known as a cap and trade scheme, basically a tax amounting to $656 billion. Pete, could you explain a little bit more about what the cap and trade system is and why it has enormous tax and regulatory implications?
Sure. Cap and trade is a proposal to try and get a handle on carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. Those are thought to cause global warming. The science is not quite settled on exactly how much mankind is necessarily contributing to global warming through CO2 emissions, but there is a rapidly developing public concern over climate change. Well, in response to that, a lot of extremists are saying, let's just tax the devil out of industry. We're not going to call it a tax. What we're going to say is we're going to issue each segment of the U.S. economy and each firm within each segment a fixed number of carbon dioxide emission permits. In other words, you can only release so much of that gas into the air. And if you want to release more, if you have to release more in order to make your product, provide your services, why you have to purchase credits in a government-regulated, government-established market. That's what the trade part of cap and trade means. So think about this. If you're an automobile plant, you're only given emission credits that would cover your operations for 80% of the year. You'd otherwise have to leave your factory idle for 20% of the year because the machinery would take you over the pollution permits. Well, your choice is to do just that, shut down the plant. You could also try and purchase more CO2 emission permits on the open market, but then again, all those nasty costs come back into play. The exact same thing we were talking about before. These companies will have decisions to make in order to pass along those costs. That'll be in the form of higher prices in consumers, layoffs, perhaps lower stock dividends. All of them affect our economy as a whole.
And the system would have to be overseen, you mentioned, by bureaucrats in the Environmental Protection Agency. So, I mean, would that require hiring additional staff, you think, for the government?
Oh, almost certainly. It seems as if every 1,000 words added to the Code of Federal Regulations allows them to hire another bureaucrat to read those words and interpret them. I probably exaggerate, but not by much when you think about how basic and fundamental the effect will be on our economy by regulating CO2 emissions. There will have to be a lot of regulators to oversee it.
Now that we're on the topic of government bureaucrats and their mismanagement of money, I thought it would be a good time to move on to our outrage of the week.
Yes, indeed, and that outrage is globe-trotting, travel on the part of government officials. Yes, indeed, part of any job involves travel. Well, maybe not any job, but a whole lot of them. Managers travel in the private sector, salesmen in the private sector travel, lots of people travel for business, but the federal government has a problem with determining what's business, what's pleasure, what's a waste of tax dollars, and what isn't. Isn't that correct, Natasha?
Yes, it is, and apparently $2 billion on meetings and travel since 2000 is not a waste of tax dollars if you work for the federal government. Overall department spending on meetings and travel has increased over 60% since 2000. And the agencies that have seen the largest increase in such spending include the Department of Education, which saw a 246% increase, the Department of Agriculture, which saw a 175% increase, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which saw a 142% increase on meetings and travel since 2000, and USAID, which saw a 98% increase in such expenses.
That's absolutely incredible. And then when you look at what kinds of trips and meetings all this money translates into, you'll get even more outraged about it. The Department of Commerce sent 31 people to Greece for the International Sea Turtle Symposium. That was a cost of $84,000. I know that here in Washington, D.C., the Department of Commerce has a national aquarium in the basement of its building, but I wouldn't think that they'd have to send 31 people to go find sea turtles to stock the aquarium or study sea turtles so they can understand them better at their aquarium. It just doesn't make any sense. And in fact, those 31 attendees took 81 days of annual leave while they were in Greece, suggesting that there was a whole lot of pleasure being mixed with that business.
Another example of kind of questionable travel expenses is the 17th International AIDS Conference in Mexico City, Mexico, which was held last summer, which cost almost $500,000 to send 100 federal employees to this event. Now, AIDS, is an international concern, so we're not necessarily questioning whether or not it is a health problem, but some of the workshops and events at this conference included the, quote, Sex Workers Mini Film Festival, a workshop on the sexy life after HIV infection, or a skills building workshop entitled Good Catholics Use Condoms.
Oh goodness, that's not a family word, so we won't mention that again. Yikes. In any case, all of this kidding aside, AIDS is a very serious issue, as Natasha noted, and much of it is preventable with relatively cheap technologies and medical innovations. For example, about 700,000 infants are newly infected with HIV each year as a result of mother-to-child HIV transmission. It costs about $8 to prevent the transmission of HIV from one infected mother to a newborn. It's a drug called nevirapine. My apologies to all the doctors out there who know exactly how to pronounce that. At $8 a dose, you can immunize an infant from transmission of HIV from the mother. Well, I should say a newborn. Now, the event itself in Mexico City cost $25 million overall, and the federal government itself spent about $500,000 sending their delegates. $500,000. Think about how many newborns could have been protected from HIV at $8 a piece if we had spent that $500,000 on this very kind of preventative medicine. You're talking about a good 50,000 newborns, maybe even 60,000. What a shame. Let's all remember that most of this federal spending in the stimulus package, and most of it in the federal budget today, most of the increase at least, is going to be passed along to our children in the form of higher debt. That's a gift that newborns in America don't need. We need to return that to sender and start paying our own way in this world. And with that note, I want you to all remember too, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power, and that's done through speaking of taxpayers. I'm Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano. Thanks for joining us this week.